The darkness was thick, without a single ray of light. Daphne no longer knew how many days had passed since she last saw the sky. The cold chain bit into her ankle, leaving a raw, bleeding mark every time she moved. The concrete floor sank its chill deep into her bones. Somewhere in the dark corner, water dripped in a steady rhythm, the only sound that counted the hours for her. A week? 2 weeks? She had stopped counting the moment her throat went hoarse from screaming for help that never came. She was only a poor maid. She had come to clean up after a party and quietly go home. Yet simply because she happened to see something she was never meant to see, her entire life had been dragged down into this hell. Tonight was different from every other night. Above her came the pounding of heavy footsteps, shouting, the crash of shattering glass. Then the door burst open. Blinding light flooded in, forcing her to shield her eyes. A tall figure stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes dark as a night sky torn wide open. The one man this entire city had learned to fear, and for the first time in all those dark days, Daphne realized she was still alive. But the man who had just walked in to save her, was he a savior? Or a nightmare far more terrifying than the one she'd known? If Daphne's story has touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you're still listening. Don't forget to share this video with those who need a story about trust and human dignity. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next deeply emotional stories. The man didn't step inside right away. He stood there for a few more seconds, letting his gaze sweep across the room, memorizing every detail with the coldness of someone who had grown used to seeing the worst in human beings. Then he turned his head, his voice deep and clipped, without a single wasted word. He told his men to bring bolt cutters here, immediately, and to call a doctor to the house within half an hour, no matter what that person was doing. There were hurried footsteps above. No one asked a single question. Daphne lay motionless in the corner, her heart pounding, trying to understand what was happening. Through all the time she'd been locked away, every strange sound had signaled something terrible. But this voice was different. It carried no threat, only a kind of authority that made everyone around him lower their heads. Another man appeared at the foot of the stairs, carrying a large pair of cutters. He looked at Daphne, then at the chain, and his face briefly hardened. He seemed about to say something, but the tall man had already raised a hand to stop him. He didn't need anyone to explain. He had understood everything with a single look. He came closer, slowly, the way someone approaches a wounded animal that might bolt at any second. He bent down, keeping just enough distance so she wouldn't feel trapped. "My name is Soren," he said. "Soren Aldridge. You can hear me, can't you?" Daphne nodded. Her throat couldn't make a sound. "I'm going to cut this chain," he continued, his voice softer now, but still firm. "The noise may be a little loud. Don't be afraid." When the jaws of the cutters closed, a sharp metallic snap rang out, and the weight pressing down on her ankle suddenly vanished. That weightless feeling made her dizzy. She swayed forward, but steady hands caught her before she could fall. That hand rested on her arm with care, not squeezing, not pulling, only holding. "When was the last time you ate?" Soren asked. She couldn't remember. Yesterday, or the day before. Everything had blurred together into one dim, shapeless mass. He muttered something under his breath, then lifted her as if she weighed no more than a coat. Daphne's instincts told her to struggle, to fight, to get away. But her body was so exhausted it no longer obeyed her will. Days without enough food or water had drained every last trace of strength from her. He carried her up the stairs. Above them, the scene was chaos. Men in dark clothing were searching every corner, overturning everything, looking for something. Daphne only caught brief glimpses of walls, doors, and yellow light flashing past as he carried her through. This wasn't a dark cellar like the place she had just left. This was someone's house, someone with money. Outside, the freezing night air rushed into her lungs, so clean it made her cough dryly. Soren took off his coat and wrapped it around her before placing her inside a car. The leather seat was soft and warm. He sat down beside her, and the car started moving before she could even gather herself. "Where are you taking me?" she forced out, her voice broken. "To my house," he answered, his eyes never leaving the phone in his hand. "You need care. You need food. You need sleep." Then his voice shifted into another tone, sharp as a razor, as he gave orders to the man named Garrett in the front seat. He wanted the name of every person who had ever set foot in that place. Every single one. And he wanted Caleb found. Tonight. That name slid down Daphne's spine like ice water. She shivered faintly, and Soren noticed at once. His dark eyes turned toward her, locking onto her. "You know that name," he said. It wasn't a question. This man didn't seem to speak in questions. He spoke in certainties. Daphne swallowed hard, tasting the salt of blood at the edge of her cracked lips. She didn't answer right away. She only looked out through the window, where the city was drifting past in the darkness, and for the first time in so many days, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare had begun to close, or another nightmare had just opened. Soren's mansion stood behind tall iron gates, a building of stone and glass looming in the night like a silent fortress guarding its owner's secrets. When the car stopped, an older woman was already waiting on the front steps, her face tightening with worry the moment she saw Daphne in Soren's arms. Her name was Mirren. She had looked after this house for many years, and though her voice was gentle as she arranged the room, Daphne vaguely sensed a flicker of unusual tension in the woman's eyes, as though she was trying to hide something heavier than sympathy. She led them up to a spacious room with clean bedding, and in only a short while, a private doctor arrived, quietly examining the wound on Daphne's ankle, taking her pulse, writing notes, and working with the discretion of someone used to serving families who didn't want anyone knowing their business. Daphne let them care for her, but she didn't relax. Over the past several days, trust had become a luxury she no longer dared to possess. And though this room was warm, though the woman's hands were gentle, she still lay there with every sense stretched tight and alert, waiting for the trap she was certain would sooner or later reveal itself. She slept in broken fragments, waking in the middle of the night with her heart pounding, needing a long moment to remember where she was, and then the old question returned to torment her, whether she had traded one prison for another. The next morning, when she was awake enough to sit up, Soren entered, not knocking, but not rushing either, and he pulled a chair over and sat at a measured distance from the bed, respecting the space between them. He spoke directly to the thing she feared most. The man who had imprisoned her was named Caleb, he said, and Caleb was his cousin, as well as a man under his command in the organization. His voice didn't tremble, but something had frozen behind every word, like anger pressed so tightly down that it had turned to ice. Daphne looked at him, trying to understand how a person could speak about the crimes of his own blood with such coldness. He explained that for a long time, he had suspected Caleb of quietly building his own circle of power, trying to seize what belonged to him, and it was while following the trail of that betrayal that his men had accidentally discovered the place where she was being held. He hadn't come to save her. He admitted that without hiding from it. He had come to search for proof of Caleb's treachery, and instead, he had found a human being chained in the dark. Daphne asked why Caleb had kept her imprisoned for so long instead of dealing with her right away, and the question darkened Soren's face. He told her the truth she had already begun to suspect, that Caleb couldn't let go because of what she was holding. She had seen something she shouldn't have seen, and more importantly, she had done something Caleb hadn't anticipated. But he didn't know how far she had gone, didn't know where the evidence was, didn't know whether she had managed to tell anyone. That uncertainty was what had kept her alive. Caleb needed to know how far she had pushed it before he acted, and the fear that she might have already planted a card against him was the only reason he hadn't dared to end everything. Daphne sat in silence as she listened, realizing that what had saved her life wasn't anyone's mercy, but the cold calculation of a cruel man. She tightened her grip on the blanket in her hands, and for the first time since waking inside this mansion, she began to understand that her story was far from over, that the name Caleb would keep haunting her, and that the man sitting in front of her, no matter how decent he seemed, was still part of the very world that had drowned her. When Soren left the room, Daphne closed her eyes, and the memory of that fateful night rushed back so clearly that she could almost hear the music and laughter from the party again. It had been a grand evening gathering at a mansion belonging to the Aldridge family, and she had been only one of the people hired by a service company to clean up after the guests had gone home. Her job was quiet, invisible, clearing away empty glasses, wiping wine stains from the floor, collecting what the rich left behind after a night of pleasure. It was already well past midnight. Most of the guests had left, and she had been assigned to clean the study area in the inner wing, a quiet place separated from the main hall. She pushed the door open with her cleaning cart, intending to finish quickly and go home, only to freeze when she heard voices coming from the room next door, where the door had been left slightly ajar, letting a narrow strip of light spill out. She recognized Caleb's voice, the man she had glimpsed during the party, a young man with a smile that always seemed to linger, but with eyes that were cold. She should have stepped back. She should have pretended she hadn't heard anything, but something in that tense voice made her feet turn rigid. Through the gap in the door, she saw Caleb speaking with two strange men, and on the table were things she immediately understood had nothing to do with honest business. Stacks of money, a small storage device, and she caught scattered words about draining funds from the organization, about deceiving someone they only called the boss. Her heart pounded violently, and in that moment of panic, a strange instinct rose inside her. She took out her old phone, her hand trembling, and pressed record, capturing the conversation and a few images through the crack in the door. Not because she intended to report anyone, but because of a vague intuition that what she had just seen might one day be the last shield standing between her and disaster. She had only just managed to step back when the door swung open, and Caleb stood there, staring straight at her. For a moment, she thought everything was over. But then that familiar smile appeared on his lips again, and he changed his tone, sweetly asking who she was, what she was doing there, then letting smooth flirtations fall from his mouth, inviting her to stay, promising her things that a poor girl like her should have longed for. Daphne refused politely but firmly. She said she was only there to work, and that it was time for her to leave. Then she lowered her head, pushed the cart away as quickly as she could, trying to keep her breathing steady even though a storm had already risen inside her. She thought she had escaped, that he had believed her, that that night would become nothing more than an unpleasant memory and then pass. But she was wrong. On her way out of the mansion, before catching the late bus back to her small rented room, she did one thing that later turned out to have saved her life. She separated that recording and those images, hiding them somewhere only she knew, away from the phone she carried with her. She didn't know that Caleb's gaze following her as she left wasn't the regret of a man who had been rejected, but the calculation of a beast that had just realized its prey had seen too much. He couldn't allow a witness to exist, especially not a witness holding something that could destroy the entire power grab he had worked so hard to build. And so, a few days later, as she was on her way home after an exhausting shift, darkness crashed down over her life. Now, lying in Soren's unfamiliar room, Daphne opened her eyes, and she understood that the only thing keeping her safe now was also the very thing that had pushed her into hell, a hidden secret that both she and her enemy knew was terribly dangerous. That night, Daphne couldn't sleep, not because of her fear of Caleb, but because of a worry that gnawed at her even more deeply than concern for her own safety. And that worry was Mrs. Eleanor. As the days of captivity passed in the darkness, the thing that kept her tied to life, the thing that stopped her from giving up and made her fight each day to hold on to her breath, wasn't the longing for freedom or the hunger for revenge, but the kind, gentle face of that elderly woman. Mrs. Eleanor owned a row of old rented rooms in the poor working district of the city, the place Daphne had come to many years earlier during the darkest days of her life, when she had nowhere left to go, not a single dollar in her pocket, and not one relative in the world. She still remembered that day with painful clarity. She had stood at the door with a torn cloth bag, soaked through by the rain, and Mrs. Eleanor, a complete stranger, hadn't asked whether she had money. She had simply looked into Daphne's eyes, opened the door, pulled her inside, and set a bowl of hot soup in front of her. She let Daphne stay, taking no rent during the first months when Daphne didn't have a job, and then it was Mrs. Eleanor herself who introduced her to the cleaning service company, helping her find the first work that allowed her to stand on her own 2 feet. Mrs. Eleanor often said she had once had a daughter too, but that child hadn't been able to stay with her for long, and every time she looked at Daphne, it was as though she saw a piece of the daughter she had lost. They became each other's family, 2 poor souls leaning on one another in the middle of a cold city, and Daphne, who had once been a lonely girl, learned that blood wasn't the only thing that made people kin. In recent years, Mrs. Eleanor's health had declined quickly. Her legs had grown weaker. The illness inside her body required steady medication, and from every dollar Daphne earned through exhausting shifts, she saved most of it to care for her. She cleaned other people's houses until her hands and feet ached, took extra night shifts even when she was worn down, all so that every month there would be enough money for medicine and hospital bills for the woman who had rescued her life. That was why, during the days she was chained in the dark, the thought that tormented her most wasn't death, but the image of Mrs. Eleanor lying alone in that shabby rented room, out of medicine, with no one to care for her, not knowing why the lonely girl she loved had suddenly disappeared. Daphne wondered whether the old woman thought she had abandoned her, whether the girl she had once taken in had turned out, in the end, to be nothing but an ungrateful person who walked away when she was at her weakest. That fear hurt more than any chain, and it was the very thing that forced Daphne to live, to cling to each passing day, because she knew that if she collapsed, the only person in the world who still needed her would collapse too. Now, lying in the warm room of a powerful stranger, Daphne realized that even though she had been saved, her rescue still wasn't complete, as long as she didn't know whether Mrs. Eleanor was safe. She couldn't lie still and accept this safety while her second mother might be struggling alone somewhere out there. Her tears slipped quietly onto the pillow, not because of what she had endured, but because of a fierce love she had no one to tell. And in the darkness, she whispered a promise to herself that no matter what she had to give up, she would find her way back to Mrs. Eleanor. And she wouldn't let that kind woman be alone for even one more day. The next morning, when Mirren brought breakfast up to the room, Daphne couldn't hold herself back anymore. She took the housekeeper's hand and begged in a choked voice, asking whether there was any way she could learn news about someone, an elderly woman living in a poor boarding house, someone she feared might be in danger because of her absence. Mirren hesitated for a moment, and that strange, troubled look from the first night passed through her eyes again. Then she only said Daphne should ask Soren directly, that perhaps she would be surprised. Daphne didn't understand what those words meant until that afternoon, when she went to see Soren in his study and stammered out her fear for Mrs. Eleanor, already preparing herself to plead, to trade something, anything, so he would agree to help. But Soren merely looked up from the pile of papers, gazed at her with calm eyes, and said one sentence that left her frozen. He told her the old woman was still all right, her medicine had been fully taken care of, and the hospital bills for her upcoming treatment had already been paid. Daphne stood there stunned, unable to believe what she had heard. She asked again and again who he was talking about, how he knew, and Soren slowly explained that from the earliest days, while investigating her to understand her circumstances, his men had traced the connection between her and Mrs. Eleanor. They had seen the small amounts of money she regularly set aside for the old woman, and he had quietly sent people to find her and arrange everything, without ever intending to tell Daphne. She asked why he would do such a thing for a complete stranger, a poor old woman who had no value at all to a powerful man like him. And in that moment, for the first time, she saw a crack open in Soren's cold exterior. He set down his pen, stayed silent for a long while, then said he had seen too many people abandoned simply because they were poor, because they had no one standing behind them, and he knew exactly what it felt like to be treated by the whole world as though he didn't exist. He said she had endured enough, that she shouldn't have to carry fear for someone she loved, while she herself had not yet recovered, and that caring for the old woman cost him very little, but it was something he could do to give Daphne back a small piece of peace. Daphne felt her throat tighten, and the tears she had tried to hold back for so many days suddenly spilled over, impossible to stop. But this time, they weren't tears of fear or despair. They were something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time, the ache of being moved by kindness that demanded nothing in return. She looked at the man before her, the man this entire city feared, the man whose hands had surely been stained by things she didn't dare imagine, and she began to understand that a human being couldn't be folded neatly into a single word, good or bad. She softly thanked him, but Soren only shook his head and told her not to thank him, because he hadn't done it to be thanked. He said that in his world, everything was exchange, calculation, debts that had to be paid, and it had been far too long since he had done something without expecting anything back. Maybe, he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, that was how he reminded himself he was still a human being. Daphne left the study with a strange feeling rising inside her heart. The wall of suspicion she had built around this man had begun to crack, and for the first time since she had been rescued, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this place wasn't another prison, and perhaps this man wasn't an enemy, but something she still couldn't name. While Soren's machinery worked urgently to follow every lead that might point to Caleb, an unexpected name appeared in the network of shady operators Caleb had tied himself to in order to build his own circle of power. It was a man named Dale Hooper, the owner of a cleaning service company that served as a front for laundering Caleb's dirty money. When Garrett placed the man's file on the desk, Soren recognized the name at once, because this was the former employer Daphne had mentioned during their scattered conversations. The man who had exploited her without mercy, cheated her out of the wages she had earned with her sweat and exhaustion, using one excuse after another, and more than once had thrown insults at her poor and lowly status, treating her as though she were some cheap object he could trample whenever he pleased. Soren sat motionless for a long while after reading the file. Then he stood and told Garrett, in a voice so flat it was chilling, that he wanted to see the man that very night. They found Dale Hooper in his shabby office, where he was counting stacks of money beneath a sickly yellow light, and when Soren entered with several of his men, the other man went pale, sprang to his feet with a trembling, eager smile, and stammered out a question about what matter could possibly bring a man of Soren's stature to visit him in person. Soren didn't answer right away. He merely sat down at the chair across from him with unhurried ease, his dark gaze locked on Dale, and his silence grew so heavy that Dale began to sweat, stumbling through one denial after another, even though no one had accused him of anything yet. Only then did Soren speak, his voice not loud at all, but every word falling like a piece of cold stone. He said Dale had done business with Caleb, had involved himself in helping Caleb betray the organization, and that alone was enough to end everything Dale had. Dale dropped to his knees and begged, pushing all the blame onto Caleb, swearing that he was only a hired man who didn't know anything, but Soren stopped him with a single flick of his hand. Then he added something that left the man frozen. He mentioned a girl who had once worked for him, a maid whose wages he had stolen, and whom he had insulted without restraint, and he asked Dale whether he still remembered how he had treated her. Dale stared blankly, clearly having forgotten the small person he had once crushed underfoot, because to him, people like her were only nameless shadows passing briefly through his life. That very forgetting made Soren even colder. He said Dale's problem wasn't that he was cruel, but that he believed there were people who could be crushed without anyone ever paying a price for it. Today, Soren said, he would learn that he had been wrong. Soren's men stepped forward, and what happened afterward was swift, precise, and without a single wasted word. The man was completely subdued. Every illegal asset he had accumulated was seized. His filthy business network was exposed and handed over to the authorities, along with enough evidence to ensure that he would never have another chance to lift his head again. Soren didn't need to act with brutality. His true power lay in the fact that he could destroy a man without leaving a single bruise, with nothing more than a nod and an underground network moving according to his will. Before leaving, he leaned close to the trembling man and said softly that from this moment on, the name Dale Hooper would no longer mean anything in this city, and that was the price for daring to look down on another person's dignity. When he stepped out into the night, Soren felt no satisfaction. His face remained as cold as stone, but deep inside, he knew he had just done something that wasn't entirely for the organization, but for a girl who had taught him to remember that some people, no matter how small they seemed, still deserved to have someone stand up and protect them. Over the following days, Daphne's body slowly recovered. The color returned faintly to her skin, and her legs had enough strength to carry her around the mansion without trembling anymore. But the wounds inside her soul didn't heal that quickly. Every night, when the house sank into silence, the darkness pulled her back to those days of terror, and she often startled awake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing wildly, both hands clawing through the air as if trying to tear away an invisible chain. There were nights when she shot upright with a strangled cry caught in her throat, and each time it happened, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway. Then Soren's tall figure appeared in the doorway, quiet, careful, never intruding. The first time he appeared, she had panicked and pulled the blanket up to cover herself. But he only stood outside the threshold, keeping the proper distance, speaking in a steady, low voice that she didn't need to be afraid, that he only wanted to make sure she was still all right. Gradually, that presence became a strange habit that brought her a sense of safety. And on the nights that followed, when she woke, he would often pull a chair into the corner of the room and sit there, not saying much, simply staying until her breathing became even again. In those silent late-night hours, between two people who had come from worlds far apart, conversations began to grow. At first, only a few scattered sentences, then slowly deepening. She told him about the lonely years, about the feeling of having to brace herself just to survive in a world that always looked at the poor with contempt, and he listened with an attentiveness she had never expected from a powerful man. Once, she asked him whether nightmares ever disappeared, and he stayed silent for a while before answering that he wasn't someone who had lived through what she had lived through, but he had seen enough people carrying wounds no one could see, and he knew that those nightmares didn't vanish. People only learned how to live beside them. so they no longer had the power to rule them. That answer didn't comfort her in the usual way, but its raw honesty eased Daphne more than any empty soothing words ever could. Once her health had stabilized, one great question began pressing down on her: where she would go, and what she would do next, because she couldn't stay forever in the mansion of a stranger. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized a harsh truth: that she had nowhere safe to return to. As long as Caleb was still free out there, as long as he still believed she was holding something that could destroy him, then she and Mrs. Eleanor would never truly be safe. If she left, if she returned to her old life with that shabby rented room and those hired shifts, she would become easy prey. And worse, she would pull Mrs. Eleanor into danger with her. She told Soren this late one night, her voice full of hesitation, saying that she understood staying here meant stepping deeper into a dangerous world, but it was also the only place where she and the person she loved could be protected from Caleb. Soren looked at her for a long time, then said he would never force her to stay, that the choice was hers, but if she chose to remain here, he promised to protect her and the old woman with everything he had. Daphne nodded, and in that moment, she understood that her decision to stay wasn't because she was weak or dependent, but because it was the wisest choice to keep two people safe. And for the first time, she felt she was no longer facing the darkness alone. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who let go easily, and when he realized that imprisoning Daphne was no longer possible after she had been rescued, he turned to another weapon, one more subtle and more poisonous, which was to smear his own victim. One morning, Garrett brought Soren a stack of documents and several online articles, his face more serious than Daphne had almost ever seen it. And when she looked at them, she could hardly breathe. On those tabloid pages, her face had been published alongside vicious words, falsely accusing her of being a professional thief who had used her cleaning work to break into wealthy homes and steal property. Caleb had used money and connections to build a complete false record, including bought witnesses who claimed she had stolen items from homes where she had once worked. He had even filed a lawsuit against her in court, accusing her of breaking in and stealing at the Aldridge party itself, turning the entire story upside down to transform her from a victim into a criminal. His purpose was painfully clear. If he could make the world believe Daphne was a liar and a thief, then any accusation she made against him, any evidence she produced, would be seen as the retaliation of a criminal caught in the act, worthless and untrustworthy. Daphne sank down into the chair, her hands trembling as she held the article, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet was collapsing, because she understood too well the weight of slander against a poor person with nothing to defend herself. She had seen people like her destroyed by a single rumor, and now an entire media machine backed by money was grinding her reputation to dust. But this time, she was no longer alone. Soren took the article from her hand, glanced through it, then placed it on the table with a frightening calm, and he said Caleb had made a grave mistake by thinking she was still prey with no one standing behind her. In the days that followed, Daphne witnessed a kind of power entirely different from anything she had ever seen, not the strength of fists or threats, but the strength of an underground network moving quietly and efficiently enough to chill the blood. Soren brought in the best legal team, people who exposed every flaw in Caleb's forged record, traced each bribed witness, and laid bare their lies. He had his people gather evidence that Caleb had fabricated documents, paid bribes, and built a false story. And within a short time, the very articles that had once smeared Daphne were taken down one after another. In their place came corrections, public apologies from newsrooms that realized they had been used. Caleb's lawsuit wasn't only dismissed, it turned back against him as evidence that he was the one guilty of slander and forged records. Daphne watched everything reverse with both relief and astonishment in her heart. She realized that in a world where money and power could twist even the truth, what decided the outcome wasn't always who was right or wrong, but who had enough strength to protect their own truth. And for the first time in her life, the person standing on her side was the strongest one. Caleb's attack through soft power failed completely, and that failure didn't merely humiliate him, it also pushed him toward a dead end, because now his own reputation was shaken. The circle of power he had built began to doubt him, and most importantly, he understood that as long as Daphne remained under Soren's protection, every indirect scheme was useless. Desperation began to gnaw at Caleb, turning him from a coldly calculating man into a beast cornered against the wall, and those driven to the end of the road often no longer know fear or calculation. All they have left is reckless madness. Soren understood that clearly, and one evening, as he looked out the window into the night, he quietly told Garrett that Caleb now had nothing left to lose, and a man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous kind of man. So they had to stay alert, because Caleb's next strike would no longer be made of paperwork or words. The confusion Daphne had glimpsed in Mirren from the very first night, the evasive look in her eyes whenever Caleb's matter was mentioned, turned out not to be simple sympathy, as Daphne had thought, but the sign of a secret weighing heavily on that woman's conscience. Everything came to light one afternoon when Garrett, while reviewing the entire security system to find out how Caleb kept getting inside information, discovered mysterious calls coming from within the mansion itself. When Soren had his people trace them, the trail led straight to Mirren, and when she was called into the study to be confronted, the older woman didn't deny it. She only stood there, her shoulders trembling, then collapsed into broken sobs. In the stunned silence of everyone present, Mirren confessed that she had been Caleb's eyes and ears all this time, that information about activity in the house, about Daphne, about every movement Soren made, had all been passed out by her. Soren stood motionless, his face hardening as though carved from stone, because Mirren wasn't an ordinary servant. She had been with his family for many years, had cared for him since the days before he had taken on the weight of this entire heavy empire. She was almost the only family left from a time before the underworld swallowed him whole, and her betrayal cut into him deeper than any blade. But when he asked why, his voice didn't roar. It only dropped into a low, painful heaviness, and Mirren's answer made the whole room sink into an unexpected sorrow. She said Caleb had found her weakness, that he knew she still had one grandson, the child of her late daughter, and he had threatened to hurt that innocent boy if she refused to cooperate. Through her tears, she said she had lived through months of hell, torn between her loyalty to Soren and the fear of losing the last drop of her own blood, and each time she passed information outside, she felt as though she were strangling her own conscience with her own hands. She fell to her knees before Soren and begged his forgiveness, saying she didn't expect her life to be spared. She only hoped he would understand that she had never wanted to harm him, that she had been forced into a place where there was no choice left. Then she said something that made Daphne's heart clench. In a choked voice full of remorse, she admitted that she was the one who had accidentally revealed Mrs. Eleanor's existence to Caleb. She explained that once, when Caleb pressed her hard about how Daphne could be controlled, she had let slip the elderly woman whom that girl loved like her own mother, the only person in the world who could become Daphne's weakness. She hadn't imagined that words spoken in terror would become a danger, and now, looking at Daphne's bloodless face, all she could do was cry and repeat her apology again and again. Daphne stood there, her heart a chaos of anger, fear, and an unwanted kind of understanding, because she knew better than anyone what it felt like to protect someone you loved at any cost, what it felt like to be backed against a wall with no way out. She couldn't wholly blame Mirren, though the woman's betrayal had placed Mrs. Eleanor in danger, because she knew that if she were in the same position, perhaps she too would do anything to save her own flesh and blood. Soren remained silent for a very long time, the anger inside him surging up and then being forced back down, and in the end, he didn't punish Mirren in the way his world usually punished traitors. Instead, he ordered his people to bring her grandson to safety immediately and place him under strict protection, cutting off the string Caleb had used to control her. But even as he did that, his face stayed heavy, because he understood that news of Mrs. Eleanor was now in the enemy's hands, and a new storm was drawing near. Knowing full well that danger was drawing near, Soren decided not to let Daphne live any longer with the torment of not knowing how Mrs. Eleanor was doing, and he arranged a carefully protected trip to take her to visit the woman. When the car stopped in front of the old row of rented rooms, Daphne could hardly wait for the door to open before she rushed out, and the moment she saw Mrs. Eleanor sitting by the small window, her face broke open with emotion too deep for words. The two of them threw their arms around each other. The old woman's trembling hand stroked Daphne's hair as she stammered through words of joy and grief, while Daphne cried like a child who had found her way home after days of wandering. Mrs. Eleanor looked rosier now, thanks to the medicine that had been fully taken care of, and when she learned that the person behind all of it was the quiet man standing at the threshold, she took Soren's hand in her thin, bony hands, her eyes wet with tears, and thanked him with such heartfelt sincerity that he, a man used to fear and flattery, seemed briefly at a loss for how to respond. The old woman insisted that both of them stay for a meal, and though the room was cramped, though the table held only a few simple dishes hastily prepared, the warmth inside that small room was greater than any lavish banquet Soren had ever attended. He sat down on the old wooden chair, looking somewhat out of place in his expensive suit against the poor surroundings. But Mrs. Eleanor treated him without the slightest hesitation or servility. She placed food into his bowl, asked after him as though asking after a son, and that simple sincerity melted something that had been frozen for a long time inside the powerful man's heart. Daphne quietly watched him in that setting, saw him smile, a rare, real smile with no trace of calculation, and a strange warmth rose inside her, because she realized that the man feared by the entire city, when placed in the middle of a poor meal shared by two small people, became close, familiar, and deeply human. During the meal, Mrs. Eleanor told little everyday stories that made them both laugh, and there was a moment when Daphne's hand accidentally touched Soren's as they reached for the same bowl. They both froze, their eyes meeting in a brief, meaningful silence. Then they hurriedly looked away like two awkward people trying to hide something that was growing quietly in their hearts. When it was late and time to leave, Mrs. Eleanor saw them all the way to the door. She held Daphne's hand tightly, then turned to Soren, looking at him with the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to understand many things, and softly said that she believed he was a good man, that she only hoped the two of them would cherish each other, because in this world, finding someone who truly protected you was more precious than all the gold and silver there was. Those plain words left both Daphne and Soren silent, and all the way back, inside the quiet car. Neither of them said a word, but the distance between them seemed to have narrowed, and a bond that needed no name had quietly begun to bloom. Daphne rested her head against the window, her heart filled with a peace she hadn't known in a very long time. She allowed herself to believe that perhaps brighter days were waiting ahead, that perhaps, at last, she could have a real home with the people she loved. But she didn't know that during those very sweet hours, somewhere in the darkness of the city, Caleb was clenching his fists, his face twisted with despair and rage, and he had decided to make his final strike, aiming straight at the most precious thing he had just learned about, the one weakness that could force Daphne to her knees. That fragile peace, which no one could have foreseen, was the last quiet moment before the real storm came crashing down. The storm came the next morning, when Soren's phone rang with a call from an unknown number, and the moment he answered, his face darkened in a way Daphne had never seen before. On the other end was Caleb's voice, no longer smooth and sweet with calculation, but dry, harsh, and mad, the voice of a man who had lost everything. He announced that Mrs. Eleanor was in his hands, that his men had launched a ruthless ambush during the night, overpowering the guards Soren had left behind, and he laid out his cold condition. Either Daphne would hand over all the evidence she had hidden and appear by herself, alone, or the old woman would never come home. When Soren lowered the phone and turned to tell Daphne, she felt the whole world collapse beneath her feet. Her knees buckled, and she had to grab the arm of the chair to keep from falling. For one moment, she was thrown back into the darkest days, swallowed by helplessness and fear, because the thing she had dreaded most all this time had finally become true. Her second mother, the gentle woman who was suffering danger now only because she loved Daphne, had been imprisoned by the very man who had destroyed her life. Tears streamed down her face, and she repeated again and again that it was all her fault, that if only she had never stepped into that fateful party, if only she had never seen what she shouldn't have seen, then Mrs. Eleanor wouldn't have had to suffer like this. But in the middle of her collapse, something inside Daphne began to change, because she was no longer the weak girl chained in the dark. She wiped away her tears, and when she lifted her head, there was no longer only fear in her eyes. A small flame of determination had begun to burn there. She told Soren that she wouldn't sit still and wait, that she would do anything to save the old woman, even if that meant turning herself over according to Caleb's demand. Soren objected at once. He gripped her shoulders and said firmly that handing herself over to Caleb was no different from suicide, that once Caleb had both her and the evidence, he would have no reason left to keep either of them alive. And that was exactly the trap he had laid. The two of them faced each other in tension, and for the first time, Daphne didn't yield. She insisted that this was her family, her life, and she had the right to take part in deciding the fate of the person she loved, not stand outside waiting, while others decided for her. Soren looked at her for a long time, and then the hardness in him softened. He realized she was no longer a victim who needed to be protected passively, but a person with will and courage that deserved respect. At last, he nodded, but with one condition, that they wouldn't do things Caleb's way. They would turn the game against him. The two of them sat down together and laid out a careful plan. Daphne would appear just as Caleb had demanded, so he would believe he still held the advantage, but the real evidence would never fall into his hands. Soren explained that the evidence she was holding was the only card keeping Mrs. Eleanor safe, because as long as Caleb hadn't recovered it, he wouldn't dare act, and so they had to use it as bait, while absolutely never allowing him to take it. He positioned his people to set a trap around the exchange location, while also backing up the evidence and sending one copy to a safe place, so that no matter what happened, Caleb would never be able to silence the truth. When everything had been arranged, Daphne drew a deep breath. Her heart still trembled with fear for Mrs. Eleanor, but her hands no longer shook. She looked at Soren, and in both their eyes was an absolute sense of unity. Together, they would walk into the tiger's den, not as predator and prey, but as two people determined to take back what belonged to them from the hands of darkness. The exchange location Caleb chose was an abandoned warehouse deep in the old harbor district, where rusted containers were stacked one on top of another beneath the cold moonlight, and the slap of waves against the stone embankment was the only sound breaking the deathly stillness. Daphne walked in alone, exactly as demanded, each footstep echoing across the damp concrete floor. Her heart was pounding hard, but her face held a calm so strange it almost didn't seem like her own, because she knew that somewhere behind the darkness, Soren's men had quietly sealed the place in a waiting circle, and Soren himself was somewhere very close. Caleb emerged from the shadows, his face gaunt, his eyes streaked with the wild light of a man who had lost all reason. Beside him was Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly woman held in a chair, her face tired and frightened but her body unharmed, and when she saw Daphne, she shook her head desperately, her lips moving as she begged Daphne not to risk herself for her. Caleb gave a thin laugh. He held out his hand and demanded that Daphne hand over the evidence, his voice trembling with impatience. And this was the moment Daphne knew she had to distract him. She hadn't brought the real evidence with her. Instead, she began to speak, her voice ringing clearly through the warehouse. She deliberately stretched out the conversation, pretending to negotiate, asking questions, touching his pride and bitterness, drawing him into arguing with her until his guard began to slip. She told him the evidence had been hidden somewhere that would automatically release it if she didn't return safely. And those words made Caleb stop short. Suspicion and fury showed plainly on his face, and in that very second of distraction, she tipped her head in a signal they had agreed on beforehand. At once, the darkness around the warehouse came alive. Soren's men surged in from every direction, and in the middle of the chaos, Soren stepped out from behind the crates, calm and commanding, like a king entering his own territory. Caleb's men were subdued before they could react, and Caleb, realizing he had fallen into a trap, roared in desperation and lunged toward Mrs. Eleanor, trying to use her as his final shield. But Soren was faster. He rushed forward and stopped him, and this time he didn't stand back and give orders to his men as he usually did. He acted himself. The two men struggled, and though Caleb fought with the madness of despair, he was no match for Soren, whose every movement carried the force of discipline and the absolute coldness of a ruler. In only moments, Soren had thrown him to the floor and pinned him hard against the warehouse ground, ending all resistance without needing any needless brutality. As Soren's men moved in to bind Caleb, Daphne didn't stand still and wait. She rushed straight to Mrs. Eleanor's side, trembling as she removed the restraints, then wrapped her arms around the sobbing old woman and kept whispering that it was over, that she was safe now. Soren stood, straightened the front of his coat, and looked down at Caleb, subdued at his feet. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep weariness, and in a low voice, he told Caleb that the game was over, that he had lost, not because he was weak, but because he had chosen to target innocent people in order to get what he wanted. The evidence remained intact in Daphne's hands, safe and never once outside their control, and Mrs. Eleanor had been rescued without harm. When the three of them stepped out of the dark warehouse and into the lights of the authorities arriving outside, Daphne supported Mrs. Eleanor in the middle, with the mother who had saved her life on one side and the man who had become her shelter on the other. And for the first time after so many terrifying months, she felt that the darkness had truly fallen behind her. With all the evidence Daphne had risked her life to preserve, along with Mirren's detailed testimony about the illegal acts Caleb had carried out, the case was quickly handed over to the authorities, and this time, no power and no amount of money could save him. Caleb was arrested on a series of charges: from kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment to shady financial operations and conspiracy to betray the organization, and the sentence awaiting him seemed almost decided before the trial had even begun. But before he was escorted away, during the final meeting between the two cousins at the detention facility, Caleb said something to Soren that he had never expected, something that cut into him even more deeply than the betrayal itself. Caleb sat there with both hands cuffed, yet a bitter smile still lingered on his lips, and he looked straight at Soren as he said that Soren shouldn't be so quick to think of himself as noble, that there wasn't much difference between the two of them. He said Soren had simply been luckier than he was, lucky enough to be chosen by the predecessor as the heir, handed an entire empire while Caleb had been treated like a useless piece on the board, pushed to the edge, crushed beneath the heel of the very organization Soren now held in his hands. He spoke of the former leader, the man who had built this whole empire, and said with a voice full of resentment that it was those cruel rules, that cold machine itself, that had turned him into the man he was today, planting hatred and the feeling of being robbed inside him from the time he was still very young. That organization you're so proud to protect, he said, crushed countless people before you ever realized it. People like Daphne, people like me, all of us nothing but broken pieces under its wheels. Soren stood in silence, because he knew there was a piece of truth in those venomous words, a truth he had deliberately avoided looking at for all these years. Caleb didn't deny his crimes. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and that made his words carry even more weight, because they weren't the pleas of a coward, but the raw confession of a man who had been created by that very system and then swallowed by it. Soren left the detention facility with his heart heavy, and for many days afterward, Caleb's words kept echoing in his mind, forcing him to face a question he had avoided for far too long. He realized that punishing Caleb, no matter how deserved it was, still didn't touch the true root of the problem, because as long as that corrupt machine kept running, more men like Caleb would be born, and more women like Daphne would be trampled. He had spent his entire youth carrying the legacy of the man before him, maintaining an empire built on fear and cold blood, and he had told himself he was different because he had rules, because he didn't touch the innocent. But now he understood that being kinder inside a cruel system didn't make the system any less cruel. One night, standing by the window and looking out at the city glittering with lights, Soren made the decision he had perhaps been moving toward in silence since the day he found Daphne chained in the dark. He called Garrett in and told his loyal associate that it was time to end it, not to end an enemy, but to end the entire path he had walked for so long. He decided that he would dismantle all the underground operations step by step, transform everything onto a legal path, cut off the dark connections, and use his power and wealth to build something more decent. He knew that road would be long and full of thorns, that an empire couldn't be erased in a single morning or evening, but for the first time in many years, he felt he was moving in the right direction, and the force driving him forward wasn't ambition or power, but the image of a girl who had taught him that human dignity was worth sacrificing everything for. Many months passed after that fateful night at the harbor, and Daphne's life had turned to an entirely different page, not because of some miracle fallen from the sky, but because of her own hands and the dignity she had never lost. When everything settled down, Soren offered to arrange a comfortable life for her, one free from worry, but Daphne refused. She said she didn't want to be given things. She wanted to stand firmly on her own, through her own ability, and she did just that, because during her time living in the mansion, her carefulness, devotion, and sharp eye for detail had been noticed by many people, and when Soren began transforming his holdings into legitimate operations, he invited her to help manage one of the new projects, not out of pity, but because he knew very well that she had the talent and trustworthiness to take on the work. Daphne started from small positions, learning constantly, and through diligence and an honest heart, she gradually proved her worth. From a nameless maid who had once been trampled by the world, she became someone respected for her real contributions. She often said that her new position or higher salary wasn't what made her proudest, but the feeling of being seen as a person of value, of being treated with the respect she had longed for all that time. Mrs. Eleanor, the second mother who had rescued Daphne's life, now lived peaceful days in a small, warm house with a sunny yard. Her health was carefully looked after, and every weekend Daphne visited her, bringing the dishes she liked, sitting beside her and telling funny stories until evening fell. The kindness Mrs. Eleanor had planted during Daphne's most desperate days had finally blossomed and borne fruit, and she often held the hand of the girl she loved like her own daughter, saying she had never stopped believing that goodness would one day be repaid. As for Soren, the feeling that had quietly grown between them through sleepless nights, simple meals, and the times they had crossed life and death together, had finally reached the moment when it could be given a name. On a peaceful afternoon, as they sat together on Mrs. Eleanor's porch and watched the sunset turn the yard golden, Soren turned to Daphne and said that all his life, he had grown used to living inside calculation and fear, used to seeing people as pieces on a board, until she came into his life and taught him what it meant to feel something sincere, something that asked for nothing in return. He said he couldn't promise her a perfect life, because his road out of the darkness was still long, but he could promise that he would always cherish her, always stand on her side, and spend the rest of his life becoming a man worthy of her. Daphne looked at the man who had once made the whole city tremble, the man now opening his heart before her with simple, honest sincerity, and she smiled through tears of happiness. She took his hand and softly answered that she had chosen to stay beside him not because he was powerful or wealthy, but because he was the one who had seen her worth when the whole world turned away. They chose each other, not as a savior and someone saved, but as two people who had walked through darkness together and decided to move toward the light together. And in that moment, beside the gentle old mother and the man she loved, Daphne understood that she had truly found a home, a family made not by blood, but by love and choice. Daphne's story didn't close with revenge or glory, but with a simple and profound truth, that a person's dignity never lies in the status or wealth they possess, but in the way they preserve their self-respect in the face of hardship, and that what truly defines each person's worth is the kindness and respect they offer one another. Sometimes, just one small act of kindness, one hand reaching out at the right moment, can lift an entire life that seemed to have fallen beyond saving. And goodness given away is never meaningless, because sooner or later, it will return to warm our own hearts. If Daphne's story has touched your heart and left you with something quiet to hold on to, please press like and subscribe to our channel so that each day you can listen to more meaningful stories like this. Please also share this video with the people you love, so we can spread the beautiful values in life together. We'd truly love to know how you feel about this story, so please leave a few lines in the comments to share the emotions deep in your heart, because every word you share is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a peaceful life, and joy in each ordinary day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.